Someone in their mid-40s sits across from you at dinner. Successful, grounded, clearly not lacking in social intelligence or warmth. And at some point the conversation turns to relationships. And someone at the table asks the question that always comes up eventually. Still haven't thought about getting married? And they don't hesitate. They don't look uncomfortable or reach for a careful answer. They just say, "It's not something I want." Not, "I haven't found the right person yet." Not, "Maybe someday." Just a clean, direct answer that leaves the table slightly unsure how to respond. Most people will fill that silence with their own assumptions. They're afraid of commitment. Something must have happened. They just haven't met the right person. The idea that someone could look clearly at marriage and simply not want it, not from fear, not from damage, not from some unresolved wound, but from a genuine and considered understanding of themselves, doesn't fit neatly into the way most people think about this choice. That's what we're going to examine today, because the psychology of people who genuinely don't want to get married is more coherent and more deliberate than the assumptions usually give it credit for. Let's start with the most common misread. When people hear that someone doesn't want to get married, the first instinct is almost always to look for the wound. Something in their past, a difficult relationship, parents who had a bad marriage, an attachment style that makes deep commitment feel threatening. The assumption is that not wanting to marry is a symptom, something to be traced back to a cause and eventually worked through. For some people, that's probably accurate. Lived experience shapes what we want. And early exposure to painful or unstable relationships does leave marks. But for a significant number of people who don't want marriage, that explanation misses entirely. It locates the cause in the wrong place and draws entirely the wrong conclusions. Psychologists who study self-determination theory, developed by Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, identify three core psychological needs that drive human well-being: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. The important thing about these needs is that they don't have to be met in any one particular form. Relatedness, the need for meaningful connection with others, doesn't require marriage to be satisfied. It doesn't even require a romantic partnership. It requires genuine connection, which can take many different shapes across a lifetime. People who don't want to get married often have a very high internal locus of control. Their sense of stability, completeness, and direction comes from within, from their values, their work, their chosen relationships, their daily routines, rather than from external structures or social arrangements. For people built this way, marriage isn't an answer to a question they're carrying. The question simply isn't there in the first place. This is a meaningful distinction that often gets overlooked. For most people, marriage solves something: loneliness, uncertainty, the desire for a committed partner to build a shared life with. For people with a strong internal foundation, those things are already handled in ways that don't require formalization. They don't need a structure to feel anchored. They already are. And when you're already anchored, the anchor someone else is offering you isn't necessarily a gift. It's just weight that doesn't serve you. Now let's talk about what these people have observed, because careful observation plays a significant role in how many of them arrived at this position. These are often people who pay close attention to what's actually in front of them. And what they've watched, over the course of their lives, is a substantial body of evidence about how marriage functions in practice. Not how it's described or idealized, but how it actually plays out over time. They've seen their parents' marriages up close, their friends' marriages, the couples who stayed together long past the point of genuine connection, held in place by obligation, shared finances, or the sheer inertia of a life built together. The people who married at the expected age, because that was the script, and spent the following decades quietly navigating a life that never quite fit. The divorces that came after years of visible unhappiness, and the ones that came as a genuine surprise to everyone watching. Psychologists describe the process of making major life decisions based on observed reality rather than inherited social scripts as evidence-based thinking applied to personal choices. What these people concluded wasn't that marriage is inherently wrong for everyone. It was something more specific, that the institution itself, the ceremony, the legal contract, the social expectation surrounding it, doesn't automatically produce what people hope it will: connection, loyalty, stability, happiness, These things can exist inside marriages, but they exist because of the particular people involved and the choices they make daily, not because of the structure they chose to put around themselves. If the outcomes you actually care about don't depend on the structure becomes genuinely optional. For people who've watched closely enough and thought clearly enough, that isn't cynicism. It's just honesty. The third piece, and in many ways the most psychologically fundamental, is autonomy. Self-determination theory places autonomy at the very center of human psychological health. Not independence in the sense of isolation or self-sufficiency at all costs, but something more precise. The lived experience of making choices that reflect your own values and sense of self, rather than choices made in response to external pressure, expectation, or the path of least social resistance. When that sense of autonomy is consistently present, people report higher well-being, lower chronic stress, and a more stable sense of meaning and direction. When it's consistently eroded, the effects accumulate over years in ways that are difficult to fully undo. For certain people, marriage doesn't register as an expansion of their life. It registers as a reduction, a narrowing of the psychological space they need to function well. Not because they have bad intentions or don't value other people, but because they understand themselves clearly enough to know what their operating conditions actually require. Shared decision-making at every level, the constant negotiation that comes with a fully merged life. The way individual identity inevitably becomes entangled with someone else's. For some people, these aren't small adjustments. They're fundamental compromises that would quietly erode something essential over time. That's not selfishness. Selfishness is taking something that belongs to someone else, choosing not to enter a structure that doesn't suit you, and being honest about it rather than. Drifting through a marriage you never wanted is something different. It's self-knowledge acted on. And acting on genuine self-knowledge, even when it runs against social expectation, is one of the harder things a person can do. Research on autonomy and long-term well-being consistently shows that people whose major life choices genuinely reflect their own values, rather than obligation or social pressure, report better psychological outcomes over time. For people who don't want marriage, building a life outside that structure isn't a consolation. It's the actual answer to the actual question they were asking. So let's be clear about who these people are. They're not damaged. They're not afraid. They're not waiting quietly for someone to come along and change their mind. They are people who looked at themselves honestly, watched the world around them carefully, and arrived at a conclusion that most people never gave themselves permission to reach, because most people never stopped long enough to ask whether they actually wanted this, or just assumed they did because everyone around them seemed to. In a culture that still treats marriage as the default and singlehood as the thing requiring justification, that kind of honest self-reckoning takes more clarity than most people realize. The people who never wanted marriage weren't missing something. They were simply honest enough to admit it. If that resonated with you, leave a comment. I'd like to know what you think. I'll see you in the next video.